Okay, comedy is what we are debating next. In an interview with the Irish Times, British comedian Rowan Atkinson said it's comedy's job to offend and that cancel culture shouldn't drain it of its potential. Vong, I can't wait to hear your thoughts about this.
I think, honestly, I don't think cancel culture has been going too far in comedy. I think the only thing going too far in comedy is complaining about cancel culture. I can't take this. Every time I open up Netflix or HBO, I'm just seeing another straight white guy for 60 minutes talk about how hard it is to be a comedian and how they can't say what they want to say.
On their Netflix show.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Well, and so for me, it's like, I feel like if you're so afraid of being canceled, just quit. Like, just quit, because stand-up comedy, it takes a certain amount of bravery, and everything I say on stage, it's in joke form, but I believe in it. So if you're offended by what I say on stage, you'll be offended with me in real life too. And for me, the only two things that I think about of whether I'll say something is, do I stand behind it enough that I'll defend it if somebody gets upset with me? If it's yes, then I'll do it. The other thing too is, I think, would I say that in front of the people that I'm making fun of? Because I started out in Alberta. In my comedy career, I was like the only Asian comedian, the only gay comedian in a lineup for like 10 years. Wow. And I remember my very first comedy special in Alberta was called I Hate White People. But in Alberta.
Wow.
But it was in front of an audience of all white people because I wanted to challenge their views, because in Alberta, it's really common to say there's no such thing as racism. Yeah. We've moved past it. We're post-racial. So I was like, oh, no, I'll show you racism. And then they'd call me a racial slur, and then I'd be like, now we can talk. Now we can keep it real. Let's not pretend. But because it was in front of all white people, I felt like I could call it I Hate White People. But if it was like, it's like if somebody's making fun of like Chinese people in front of all white people, then maybe it's different. It's like, are you daring enough to say it in front of those people? And I said, if you don't have that bravery, if you're too worried of getting canceled, just quit. Yeah. Just quit. I'm tired.
But is it also?
I love that.
Is it also the idea of punching up versus punching down? In other words, punching down, people, I think, universally agree that that's a no-go zone. If you're punching down to somebody who when you bring in intersectionality, is that a difference?
I think I have a somewhat different view of this from like a lot of my friends. A lot of my friends work in human rights, but for me, because I grew up in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, Murdoch, capital Canada, very rough neighborhood, and in our culture, it's like trash talking or making fun of each other was actually a way to uplift each other. It's sort of like a challenge. So it's like if we didn't like somebody, we would ignore them. But if we're like trash talking or making fun of it, it's actually an invitation. It's actually saying, you're my equal, and I think you can rise to the challenge.
Oh, interesting.
And so, I definitely, I guess for me, the idea of punching down never came to my mind, because why would you challenge somebody who you didn't think could fight back?
That's
like,
interesting.
to me, I wouldn't even think.
I like that too.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting perspective given the generation of comic that you come from. I mean, a lot of the ones complaining about cancel culture are the generation that came before you. And I say this because one of the most exciting comics working today is Jared Carmichael. His special, which is on Crave, Nathaniel, just came out, and he came out in the special about 3 months ago. And so he, as a Black young comic, obviously looks up to somebody like Dave Chappelle, who would have shaped his career. So when asked recently what Jared thinks of Dave Chappelle, his answer was amazing, and it kind of changed my perspective on how to view the Dave Chappelle thing. And Jared said, well, I mean, if that's the hill he wants to go out on. Yeah. I'm gay. My comedy is relating to a young generation of people who are offended by Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle now, as Jared said, if you Google him, is known for one thing: stomping on trans people. And that lives forever. He's a guy who did the racial draft. He's a guy who did so many great jokes. But the only thing that people bring up right now in relation to Dave Chappelle, this comic with such a great library of jokes, is, oh, that guy who attacked trans people. That's on Google. That's a generation. And so Jared McCarmichael was like, okay, that's the legacy you want to leave, you do you. And that to me was so brilliant.
It's a great way to look at it, but the trouble with that, as I have read, is Dave Chappelle holds so much power and sway. And the idea of punching down that he's been accused of is that his words carry a consequence, not for him, for trans people. The attitude that someone might carry running into a trans person, if you are a huge fan of Dave Chappelle's, is that there are real life consequences for the jokes he makes.
And he has to wear that.
Well, he has to wear that, but people are getting beaten and die. I mean, this is what I'm saying.
That's part of his legacy.
You
If
know?
people
It's
die
awful.
because of your jokes, that's what shows up on Google in 50 years, in 75 years. Congratulations.
But his peers, I feel like Dave Chappelle hasn't, like, going back to what you said, people were saying that there's a problem in comedy about being canceled. I can't think of a comedian that has actually been canceled. There have been consequences, but Dave Chappelle just introduced Jon Stewart on stage at the Mark Twain Comedy Awards in front of his peers to massive applause. So there is not, like, consequences.
Louis C.K. just won a Grammy.
Oh, my God. Let's...